This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Well, I want to thank you for this wonderful invitation to be with you tonight, the center. And I want to thank my colleague and sister friend and leader, Dr. Bernice King. I want to thank the Currie family for making this lecture possible. And I want to thank all of you for being present tonight. It is a pleasure and an honor to be the distinguished lecturer for the annual Overton and Livonia Currie Lecture Series. So thank you for having me. I bring you greetings from New York, from where I hail, and where just yesterday I preached at the Riverside Church, pastored by the inimitable Dr. James Forbes. And I also bring you greetings from now my second home, Washington, D.C., where for the past 4.5 years, I've had the privilege of serving the President of the United States, President Barack Obama, and Secretaries Clinton and Kerry, and representing you, the United States of America, as the third ambassador at large for international religious freedom. Dr. King shared with you that I was born into a Christian family, but I also was born into a civil rights family. And Dr. Martin Luther King and Sister Coretta Scott King were just our icons as we grew up. And so to love their family and to live in their household many times, to be close to her mother and Yolanda King and the family was an honor and a privilege for me. So it's our first time sharing the stage together, and it's such an honor to see how you have been blessed and how you have shared your gifts all over the world. Let me say from the onset this disclaimer that I am now separated from government, and so my views and comments tonight shared don't reflect those of the administration, but they reflect those of my experience. The position was created by Congress under the International Religious Freedom Act, or what's now called the IRF Act, in 1998. Secretary Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State. President Bill Clinton was the President of the United States. And this was an act that was coming forth for about 12 years. And so each of us served at the pleasure of the President of the United States. President Clinton had 2 more years left in his administration, and so Ambassador Seipel was his ambassador. And then under President George W. Bush, John Hanford was the ambassador, and I was the first for President Barack Obama. The position as ambassador at large is the principal advisor to the President of the United States and the Secretary of State on international religious freedom issues, using all the tools available to us, diplomacy, foreign policy, integrating religious freedom into the foreign policy and national security discussions. It's one of the most political and perhaps most coveted posts within the administration. The ambassador at large constantly has to address religious freedom and rule of law issues. And so not only do we have to report to Congress, but it is housed within the State Department. We also report to the White House, and we also sit at large with the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. And so we have several constituencies that we're always responding to, but particularly addressing religious and rule of law issues. So we found that when there were religious communities, especially when they were able to work in conjunction and partnership with one another, and where rule of law was enforced to protect religions and religious freedoms, that they were the core and the keys to the critical stability of nations. My portfolio as ambassador, this was the only one that included all 199 countries of the world. And so it was an awesome and an amazing experience to be a diplomat for the United States, even though I had to look into some very troubling and perilous situations in some places and countries of concern where people, while at this very evening while we're convening, are fighting for their life and for their rights, to worship as they please, to share their faith, to believe as they please. When I first arrived in March 2011, our International Religious Freedom Office and the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, where my office sits, we were engrossed with many issues, but particularly with helping with the release of Pastor Nadakani, who was a Christian pastor imprisoned in Iran just because of his beliefs. And so through bilateral and multilateral approaches and pressure, we were able to help him be successfully released. There were sanctions, there were pressures of other measures placed upon this country. And as I departed this post in October of 2013, we were still fighting again for the release of Pastor Saeed Abedini, another Christian pastor who is still in prison, again in Iran. And so our multilateral and consistent prayers and approaches brought together church and state as we forged ahead for human and religious rights. So we never stopped fighting, and never stopped urging governments to do the right thing. Prior to my Senate confirmation hearings, which lasted 2 years due to a hold on my nomination, I was not only a faith leader, as Dr. King told you, but also a pastor of 3 New York City congregations and also the chaplain of NYPD for 21 years. And so I come from the most diverse city in the world, and so diversity is part of my comfort zone. It's a natural part of my portfolio. And at that particular time during my hearings before I came aboard, Minister Paul Bhatti and Governor Taseer of Pakistan had just been assassinated, and so it was a perilous time. They were assassinated because of their condemnation of the apostasy and blasphemy laws and for their cry for religious freedom for all of Pakistan's citizens. And all of that impacted how we approached and responded to certain things, both from the administration's vantage point as well as others. But let me share some of my personal interfaith and First International experiences, which really helped inform my journey and which helped perhaps for you to journey with me and seeing life through the prisms and lenses that I saw life and approached and accepted this esteemed and coveted post. My late brother, Charles, who was the first African-American New York State Assembly member from the Bronx, New York, and who Yolanda King worked for while she was in college, assumed his post at age 26. He was the first Black New York State Assemblyman, and then he was also an assistant district attorney. I, a faith leader who was elected to leadership in the American Baptist churches as a pastor and ran 4 of his campaigns in special elections, we lived, of course, under the same roof. So in our household, there was always this intersection, this nexus of religion and state. We took seriously the scripture which speaks about the law and the prophet, which is why I suppose Emory offers the law and divinity degree for the master's programs. And living under the same roof, which she describes so carefully, where our family was both Christian and very social, my parents entertained a lot and they hosted political fundraisers often. And so we had both legislators and leaders in religion always in our home, and we in theirs and at their events. So we were always surrounded by greatness, we were always surrounded by religion, we were always surrounded by social events and political events. We used to live in a high-rise near Yankee Stadium, and it was called the Executive Towers on the Grand Concourse. And there were 17 apartments on each floor. Our particular floor had 11 different faith and ethnic groups. So we learned how to live together, play together, and respect one another's rights to believe or not believe. But let me share the turning point for you in the particular area of participating in international law and religion. In 2001, it was a beautiful fall day. I was preparing to vote in the New York City primary for local elected officials when the word came that the World Trade Center had been hit. So after getting my elderly mother settled, I soon raced to the airport to try and pick up a guest minister who was coming to our church that evening, when the Triborough Bridge patrol officers and the New York City police officers frantically stopped all cars, and they closed the bridge. It was then I had to go into emergency police personnel mode, and as I looked to the right, down the Hudson River and the East River, another building was going down in flames and smoke. It was then that the second tower had been hit. And so I was no longer average citizen Johnson Cook. For the next 60 days, and really the rest of my life, I was Chaplain Johnson Cook, a changed woman, a charged woman on the front lines, helping now to pastor an entire city who were trying to come to grips with trauma and tragedy now known as 9/11. Chaplains in New York City Police Department represented all major faiths, and together we had to help fight for religious accommodations for so many faiths and ethnicities. I remember having to convince someone in the police commissioner's office that Sikhs and Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Muslims and others who had come to me had to have their respective observances honored, and that many had religious expressions in their attire that could not or should not be changed. So that particular day on 9/11, being a chaplain, we were soon asked to report to police headquarters, which were 10 blocks away from what is now called Ground Zero. And there were 26 families of police officers who were missing in action there present in police headquarters after the collapse of the towers. And there we gathered, myself and the 7 other chaplains, as we prayed and counseled and consoled and pastored and shepherded them for what would be the next 60 days of a zone that none of us had ever gone into or experienced. But it did not matter what faith or race or ethnicity we were or they were. And then we were taken to ground zero to work with the police and the firefighters who had been there all day long, and the medics who had set up shop in various buildings in the lobbies, hoping that they would find victims. And they searched the night for survivors, many of them never found. But there were many colleagues who were there, and they had been in harm's way. And when rescue personnel saw that I was a chaplain, they paused to catch their breath, to cry, to pray, and regardless of their religion, because at that moment, we saw the unifying power of religion, really almost in direct contrast to those who had tried to use religion as an excuse to commit violence against innocent people. So in the face of adversity, New Yorkers and Americans prayed together, and we became even more unified. We found our common humanity and sought common ground, and we formed municipal, national, and international coalitions of religious leaders to build bridges of understanding, respect, and tolerance, to put out suspicion, prejudice, and intolerance. And I took that with me into my ambassadorship. But that night, we saw firsthand what could happen when people put aside their religious differences and begin to work together. And so immediately in response to the fear, loss, and tragedy, multi-faith services shot up in all the city buildings, which in New York had been against the law. But now what do you do when an entire city is experiencing a paralysis of fear? The needs of the people had to trump the division and the separation of church and state. And every faction of society had to come together. We had to be one. We had to be unified and not petrified. And I felt there like the Judeo-Christian heroine and leader Deborah, whom Barak, the leader of Israeli army, came and sought out to help when Israel was experiencing a paralysis of fear. And in the book that you have tonight, Becoming a Woman of Destiny, it centers on her as a woman leader who came at a time of need. And it made me reflect back on the brilliance of President Clinton's race initiative, where he raised the question, can there be one America, in 1998? I was honored to serve on that historic advisory team of 7 as his only faith advisor. And what really surfaced for this nation was that not only America was changing drastically, but also the world was changing. We were becoming a global village. And we all had to come to grips that there would be people who did not look like, speak like, live like, eat like us, right next to us, in our families, with our schools, in our playgrounds, in our workplaces, many of whom had fled types of persecution in their own homelands, including religious persecution. And the places which were mostly raised up as what we call now promising practices for handling this new normality, were our religious institutions. And they could not be left out of the discussions nor the equations. They were central to our success. So if you fast forward in my travels as ambassador at large, I saw great things that happened when religious leaders came together to dialogue, to share ideas, to grow a vision of interfaith harmony through relationships that stretched beyond borders and beyond religions. In New York, I was also a part of an amazing international interfaith experience with faith leaders of the 3 major religions known as the Partnership of Faith in New York City, which still goes on this day. We began to be intentional about sharing not only our pulpits, but sharing our lives. So guided and brought together by the late Dr. Arthur Caliandro, who succeeded Dr. Norman Vincent Peale at the Marble Collegiate Church, he had a vision of really what true partnership looked like and should be. So we socialized, we introduced one another to our significant others in our lives. We ate the foods and we also respected the fasts of our various traditions, and we eventually called ourselves not only colleagues, but we called ourselves and we became friends. So I could use this model as a template throughout the world. It started with my appointment as a faith leader to this post. It was not coincidence, but I believe very much providence. Because as I walked into each room and approached the diplomatic tables, There was that same search for common ground that we had found on that same night of 9/11, putting aside our differences, shifting drastically the previous diplomatic paradigms, and including faith leaders at the table. And if you read or heard President Obama's comments last week at the National Prayer Breakfast, he applauded and stressed the need for faith leaders to be in the equation. He says, we're moving ahead with our new strategy to partner more closely with religious leaders and faith communities as we carry out our foreign policy. So around the world, we're elevating our engagement with faith leaders and making it a regular part of our diplomacy. And in contrast to those who wield religion to divide us, he said, let's do more to nurture the dialogue between faiths that can break cycles of conflict and build true peace, including the Holy Land. Religious freedom is the freedom to believe or not to believe as a fundamental human right, which transcends faith, background, or tradition. I hosted a number of faith leader roundtables at the State Department with regularity, where every belief was invited to the table. And the second week on the job, an imam and a rabbi both collectively stated, you're the answer to prayer. So we became a multi-faith, interfaith militia determined to bring peace to the world. And so we presided over roundtables also where other ambassadors, like the Indonesian ambassador to the U.S., led Jews and Christians and Muslims to the Holy Land together. I have to believe that the 3 years of labor and presence and insistence of participation by faith leaders helped to bring the President and the Secretary of State to this place in this moment where he could utter those words. My first diplomatic stop abroad was my first week on the job, and it was in Geneva, at the UN Geneva, introducing what is now known as Resolution 1618 to combat intolerance and to begin to implement efforts that would promote positive efforts. This had been a resolution a decade in the making, and finally an agreement of sorts had happened. My next trip would be with Secretary Clinton to the OIC meeting in Istanbul, Turkey, and meeting with heads of diplomatic delegations with the Secretary. She made an announcement there that she would host then a Resolution 1618 experts meeting that I would head. And so she said this would not be a bunch of diplomats sitting around the table talking to each other, but rather we would bring those who would implement, the law officers and other experts who would enforce and implement this law. And so we partnered with the Department of Justice and the Homeland Security to begin to look at foreign policy and national security through the lens of faith leaders. Some 60 nations would be represented as we saw role-playing and models of tolerance and how to implement in some nations that were not so open. And later, what perhaps was one of her greatest legacies, along with the creation of an office within the State Department for Public-Private Partnerships, Secretary Clinton created what's called the Strategic Dialogue with Civil Society, where faith leaders were at the table. And to integrate faith into the foreign policy and national security discussions, I had the privilege of being one of the co-chairs, and finally, faith leaders' voices were being heard in the State Department. And for this courageous, visionary move, it's now flowing, it's now growing, and it's being kept by Secretary Currie. Courses were implemented, summits at the Foreign Service Institute, where ambassadors learned their craft, and integrating religion and state were held. Two of the nations where I saw the most informed and advanced efforts of multi-faith, interfaith work that had a strong impact were Nigeria and Liberia, both West African countries. Now, Nigeria, as you may have heard, was experiencing and continues to experience much violence, mostly along ethnic lines, but which translates as religious conflict. On my trip there in January 2012, it was 1 month after a Catholic church had been bombed on Christmas Day. I was meeting with the Archbishop of Abuja, the capital, and that particular day he was on his way to do a mass burial for 50 of the victims who had not yet been claimed by their families nor anyone. He had also been the president of the Christian-Muslim interfaith efforts. And there in Abuja, this Archbishop asked me to pray with him and for him as he embarked on this very difficult yet necessary step of closure. The other instance was my final diplomatic trip abroad to Liberia. There, Muslim and Christian women joined hands, and they took on the war that was separating people because of their religious beliefs. They said, we're tired of all this killing, and 2 of the women became Nobel Peace Prize winners. But they saw the violence that was going on. They said, we're tired of this, and they marched together wearing their white. And together, hand in hand, as women of faith, they shut down government and the roads that led to the Capitol. And they said, we're not moving until men are willing to talk about partnerships, hopes, and progress. And today they still stand as one. No separation, but now they have ministers of faith, and prayers are shared at all of their meetings, both nationally and internationally. So I say there should be no separation. We still have much work to do. The degrees that you earn here must mean more than another plaque on the wall, but it's a call, it's a charge to service, to help the world to become a better place. Lawyers and ministers and doctors and teachers and students and men and women in government, civil society, including faith leaders, have to work together, and we have to walk hand in hand. So I went into the administration and the State Department, and they were focusing on these 3 Ds: democracy, diplomacy, and development. And I hope that as I exited, it will be life in a new 3D: democracy, diplomacy, and divinity. So yesterday when I preached at the Riverside Church, it was their prophetic justice Sunday, and it was also their youth Sunday. So I had to preach a message that honored and spoke to both, and I charged them to open their eyes, to really see themselves and the world that we're in, not with closed eyes, but with opened eyes. And I shared with them a poem that I share with you tonight by Carol Etzler, which said, sometimes I wish my eyes hadn't been opened. Sometimes I wish I could no longer see all of the pain and the hurt and the longing of my people and me as we try to be free. Sometimes I wish my eyes hadn't been opened. Just for a moment, how sweet it would be, not to be struggling, not to be striving, but just to sleep secretly in our slavery. But now that I've seen with my eyes, I can't close them, because deep inside me, somewhere I'd still know the road that my people and I have to travel. My heart would say yes, my feet would say go. Sometimes I wish my eyes hadn't been opened. But now that they have, I'm determined to see that somehow this day, my people and I will be the people God created us to be. So we must open our eyes. I charge you to keep your eyes opened, your hearts open, your hands and spirits ready and full to do the work, to continue the work that Dr. King and others have started. I end with these words from President Obama, the final words also from a familiar song. He said, as we build the future we seek, let us never forget those who are persecuted today, among them Americans of faith. And as we pray for all prisoners of conscience, whatever their faiths, wherever they're held, let's imagine what it's like for them. Despite all they've endured, despite the awful punishments, if caught, they will still wait for that moment when the guards aren't looking and when they can close their eyes and bring their hands together and pray. In those moments of peace, of grace, those moments when their faith is tested in ways that those of us who are more comfortable never experience, I believe that their unbroken souls are made stronger. And I hope that somehow they hear our prayers for them, that they know that along with the Spirit of God, they have our spirit with them as well, and that they are not alone. And finally, in the words of the songwriter, let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. Thank you, and God bless America. It is the land that I love. Amen.
First of all, thank you so much for that terrific presentation. One more round of applause. That was really good. But you're not just terrific, you're also prolific. You've done so many things. As ambassador at large, you were given a global platform to talk about and influence international religious liberty. You were the first and so far the only woman to ever hold this important post, but as we mentioned, you came to this position already having a history of breaking barriers. You were the first female senior pastor in the 200-year history of the American Baptist churches, the first woman elected president of the Hampton University Ministers Conference, and again, the first and so far the only woman to be named official chaplain of the NYPD. I worked there for a while. It's a boys' club, and that's just really amazing. Having spent some time now on the global stage, what can you tell us about the state of women in leadership positions worldwide?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for that line. I'll use it sometimes, prolific. That sounds good.
A little alliteration goes
I'll
along
give you a footnote. You know, women's voices were silent. You know, at the table, many times there were women in countries at the table, but they were silent. And it was through their eyes that they would look upon me and say, you know, can we see you afterwards? Can we pass you our business card? Can you be the voice for us? It's beyond voiceless. They are not able to use their voice. And it's pretty much globally. And I think even here, you know, this was the 50th anniversary not only of the March on Washington, but it's also the 50th anniversary of the women's liberation movement. And I think we still have a ways to go. In today's USA Today, in every paper each week, you still see that women are lagging behind, and women are, it is a boys' club in many ways. So I think that my passion developed for women leaders and emerging women leaders to not be their voice, but to amplify the voices of women. And so I think part of my charge and my mantle for my next stage of life is to really be to be the one who helps to amplify their voices so that women are leaders in every stage of life, every arena of life that they desire to be. Many of the women overseas were educated here in America, but they went back to their countries, which many times are oppressive and repressive. And so it's going to be, just like we saw, I believe, the onset of what happened in Tahrir Square in Egypt, I think you're going to see that gradually happening with women as they're becoming more educated, and as technology certainly is available to us. I think you're going to see more women speaking up and moving forward.
Thank you. Now, that was a bit of a softball. This one's kind of a technical
that was a softball,
question.
okay.
The International Religious Freedom Act requires the president who has delegated this authority to designate as countries of particular concern those governments that have engaged in or tolerated particularly severe violations of religious freedom. The Act defines particularly severe violations as ones that are systematic, ongoing, and egregious. In the 2013 annual report of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which you worked closely on, the committee recommended that 8 countries be redesignated as countries of particular concern. Those 8 countries are Burma, China, Eritrea, Iran, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Uzbekistan. How many of those countries were you actually able to visit, and what can you tell us about the state of affairs on the ground there?
Great. I was able to visit 3 of those countries, China, Saudi Arabia, and Uzbekistan. The situation is still pretty much egregious, and that's why they were designated again. And countries of particular concern can be designated at any particular time. But not only was I part of working on the report, but I also have to deliver that report as an ambassador to the press. And so it is pretty accurate, and I was speaking with some of the professors here. It's probably one of the most accurate documents in terms of the state of affairs of international religious freedom in the world. And they have work to do. I mean, you know, so the State Department and the Secretary of State has the authority to designate them, given by the President. And the State Department can designate them at any particular time. And each year they have to review what the countries are doing. What they're trying to do, though, is give the countries at least some small steps so that they can begin to come off of this list. And the countries that are willing and able, that was my role, to be able to talk to the governments where there was an open door. And it takes time. It took a lot of time to get on the list, and it's going to take a little time to get off the list. But the countries which are trying, there's, what we call an open door, and there's diplomacy. There's some countries that I could not go into that did not invite us. And where we could not physically go, we did one of 2 things. We either had web chats with people on the ground there, or we visited their diplomatic representatives here in Washington or in the U.S. And so and many times we were also able to meet with them at the UN General Assembly in New York. So there are many ways to try to get to them, and there are many ways to try to really The idea is not for them to stay on the list. The idea is that they will all honor the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and that somehow they will come off that list, and others will not go on. We hope the world actually will follow those agreements.
So much. I have plenty of questions, but I'm only going to ask one more question, then we're going to open it up to the floor. So if people have questions, there are microphones stationed on both sides of the auditorium. You can feel free to stand up and wait, and we'll go back and forth to the extent that we have questions for the ambassador. Now, part of your job as ambassador and as a member of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom was to make policy recommendations to the President, to the Secretary of State, and to Congress on issues of religious liberty. What do you think are the most pressing issues of the day, both domestically and internationally, and how can the U.S. be a better player on the world stage?
Well, that's a big, loaded question. We come into it as appointees on a pendulum that's been swinging a long time. And so one of the things that they do have you do is really stay in your lane, because when you have 199 countries and international religious freedom, that's a big portfolio. That's a heavy portfolio. So the reality is, in the time that you're there, whether you stayed for the whole time the president's in or not, is that you're going to only make a dent in it. I think that the most, as I said in my speech, I think one of the most important things that happened was the strategic dialogue with civil society, because it allowed faith leaders and other civil society members who have been doing this work all along, but outside of government, to be able to come and give another perspective. When you're in government, you see through one set of lenses, and you have to, and there are many layers, and it's a hierarchy, a bureaucracy, but outside gives us another perspective. So I think one of the most pressing things is that we continue that dialogue. I think the other thing that Secretary Clinton instituted was the public-private partnerships, because you have to be able to fuel this work, and government needs to find other sources to fuel the work. And I think those two working together will help with the policy as it goes forth. But I think what they're doing is, government is it's layers of people, because it's not just the State Department, but many times they're interagency efforts that we have to get together on, because there may be a perspective from another department that we have to factor in as well. So I think working together with both the civil society, but also working together with the interagency efforts with particularly national security and homeland security, those are efforts that I think will be very important in shaping our policy as we go forward.
So much. Okay, we're going to open the floor to questions now. We'll start with Justin.
Hi, Ambassador Coe.
Hello.
Thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome.
I appreciated your hopeful perspective on the role of religion in American foreign policy. I was just wondering if you might also be willing to speak on the potential risks of making religion a bigger part of foreign policy, whether those are risks to religious communities, risks for foreign policy itself or the government, and potential legal problems.
Well, I think what's important is that religion be discussed, gets on the table, whether you look at the risks or the non-risks. Most cultures other than ours, religion is at the center of their culture. And so what has not happened in the past is the diplomatic engagement has been lacking religion. So I think as you go forward, there's always a risk, but I think that there's more of an opening than a risk. As I shared in my speech, where there is a common respect and common ground that you search as religious and faith leaders, and that was the opening, the pragmatic opening that didn't exist before, because before, primarily, I believe the paradigm had been kind of, you go over, this is what we believe, this is what you need to do, and do it. Well, cultures have been engrossed in religion for hundreds of years, and unless you begin the conversation there, you're not going to get very far, and that's why I think you see so much of what we call the Arab Spring and some other things. I think that's why we see so much exploding in the Middle East and other parts of the world, because people feel disrespected in the area of religion. So I think it's less of a risk. I think it's more of an advantage to put religion on the table.
I come from China. Now I'm a visiting research fellow at BYU Law School.
Yes.
I have translated some reports, international religious reports from the Department of State of the United States from English into Chinese. I also translated some of the reports from the International Religious Freedom Commission of the United States from
Yes.
English into Chinese. So it's really a pleasure for me to be here and to
Thank
ask
you.
you
It's a pleasure
few
to meet
questions.
you.
I have two questions. The first question is as follows. I know there is a voice in the U.S. that thinks that the importance of international religious freedom is not very well recognized or appreciated among the political circle or the administration in the U.S. So I would like to hear your view or opinion on this point, and what would you do to make it a more valuable focus for the U.S. diplomacy? Yes, this is my first question. Okay. And the second question is just a follow-up. I want to follow up the 8 countries, CPC countries of particular concerns that was named in the International Religious Report. Mm-hmm. And in particular, I would like to hear your views on countries like China and also Saudi Arabia, because my impression is Saudi Arabia has a very close relationship with the U.S., and China, of course, is also a member of the United States Security Council. So I would like to hear your views on these 2 countries in particular. And also, for example, what measures can the U.S. take to kind of encourage China to be more friendly or...
That's 4 questions. Hold on. You asked for 2. Hold on. Let me try to respond to the first one, okay?
Yeah,
and
sure.
we'll try to unpack that. You mentioned the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, which we call USCIRF, and it is a separate commission also created by Congress. The ambassador at large is an ex officio member on that commission, but they have 2 separate roles. They're really more of a watchdog organization, and so they travel over the world too, and their job is to look for places that it's not working. The ambassador is an official of the U.S. government, and so many times they're not in partnership. We're not saying the same things. They are critical, and they're able to be critical. Many times we were confused as we traveled. I would arrive somewhere, and they would say, oh, you're from the United States Commission on International, and we'd have to always make that distinction. So they're going to have to work out the kinks in that, because it is often confusing. But the second thing in terms of international religious freedom on these shores, there is a definite separation. The White House Faith-Based Initiatives Office dealt with religious freedom on these shores. So the things like Terry Jones burning the Bible in Florida and other things that happened with the Catholic Church and abortion, those are religious freedoms that are domestic, and those are not issues that the State Department deals with. The State Department deals primarily and only with international issues. So I dealt with every other country but the U.S. The Justice Department and any problems that come up with religious freedom on these shores are dealt with by the Justice Department and the White House. So they're really separated. So issues here, I don't have a comment on, because that was not my role. That was not my assignment. Your second question in terms of visiting China and Saudi Arabia, what else would you like to know about them? What my visits were like when I was there, or what?
Yeah, for example, what kinds of measures can the U.S. government to adopt in order to encourage countries like China or Saudi Arabia to be more open to international religious freedom, especially, the religious freedom in China and Saudi Arabia, yeah?
Well, I'm not with the administration any longer, so I can't say what they shall do. I can tell you in terms of what I did, it was the first time the door was open, and really about 5 months before my tenure was over, that I was able to go to China. The first time I was actually refused admittance there. So, I think there's small baby steps, and what I was sharing with Mark earlier is that you have to give people a chance, and you have to make some recommendations on ways that they can be open. So we met with governments, but we also met with civil society while we were there, pastors and other congregations, and the people who didn't have a chance to speak openly, we were able to meet with offline. And I think it's going to take a long time. It didn't get like this as it was, Tibet's still an issue, and they're still talking about the self-immolations that are happening. So I think it's a very complex issue that can't be unpacked overnight. I think it's going to take a long time for that to happen. But the fact that I was able to go there and meet with them is a first step. That took a long time for the ambassador to be able to have admission to their shores. So that's a first step, and then the persons who succeed me will have to take it to the next level. But it's an ongoing process.
you very much.
You're welcome.
First of all, thank you for coming.
You're
we
welcome.
really enjoyed your speech.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to press you a little bit on what you just said.
Okay.
His Holiness the Dalai Lama just met with Barack Obama in the map room, which was the concession to the
Yes.
Chinese. I was wondering if you could talk to us at all about the complexities of the situation with Tibet and the self-immolations.
Probably really can't. I can't. I wasn't in the meeting with the president. That was a very closed meeting. I know, and the Dalai Lama said himself, he's chosen not to take a political stand any longer. He's retired from political exercise. So I can't really speak in terms of what was shared in that meeting. It's very complex, and I can press you back in terms of, not much is said. They're a very closed society. And at the diplomatic table, you try to just have a pragmatic opening. If you get one step accomplished, and I think the meeting was the first step, then that's a big deal.
I think one of the big issues for the Tibetan community is just, unfortunately, the idea of reincarnation, because, when His Holiness does expire or pass on, they're going to have a very serious issue then in terms of all the stuff going on in Tibet.
I agree.
Well,
I
yeah.
agree. It's a horrible situation, but not many are able to talk about it, and so we don't have a lot of inside information. I agree that it's their future. They have to look at what happens for succession for him, but they're under a very restricted, code, so they can't say very much. Thank you.
Adam?
Ambassador Cook, thank you so much for coming here this evening
You're
and
welcome.
for answering our questions and giving us amazing insight into the operation of this wonderful office that you were a part of. I was wondering if you had any involvement with helping to procure asylum status for religious refugees from various countries who are coming to the United States because of religious persecution. That's kind of more general part of the question. Specifically, in a country that most would associate with generally liberal and tolerant views towards religion, there's the case of Romkey v. Holder. I know that's Department of Justice, kind of outside of your purview, but that's an ongoing case that's currently seeking review by the Supreme Court, where basically a German family emigrated because of mandatory attendance laws, school attendance, and a prohibiting of private or religious education in Germany. And that decision's been appealed by the Obama administration on several accounts and been fought. And so on the one hand, I see this amazing work that you and others have done to champion religious liberty around the world. And so I'm just curious if you might have any insight into why that particular effort isn't being extended on behalf of the Romkeys in this case of seeking asylum for religious reasons.
I really can't speak to that. I didn't finish the law school at Emory, so I really can't. I really had to kind of stay in my lane. Really, it was all overseas. The things that happen here and has to be dealt with by the Justice Department, Homeland Security, and other. There are many issues that feed into a decision that the government makes, that the administration makes, and there's many things that are on the surface that we see and we read in the media, but there are a lot of things that are not on the surface, and they have to make the best decision based with all the information that they have available to them. So in terms of what happens on the United States soil, I can't speak to that.
Certainly.
Okay.
Maybe just a more general form of my question then. Did you have any involvement with refugees for religious reasons seeking asylum in this country?
We did, and they had to be off-the-record conversations because, their very lives were at stake, and their families' lives were at stake. One of the joys of being at Catholic University as a distinguished fellow is that, some of the Chinese refugees are there also as fellows. And so we can have conversations here that he could not have certainly abroad. But, I was in media. That was my first career. I was a television producer and on-air person. And I used to produce a show called Headliner in Washington, D.C. So whoever was passing through Washington who was a headliner, they were on our shows. Religious freedom is the total opposite because we try not to put people in headlines because their families, their lives are at stake. So usually if we really have a success, we have to get them out of their country, out of harm's way, and we have to place them in places where no one really knows where they are except the State Department. And sometimes I won't even know because it's at that level and that degree degree of harm that will come to them. So you have to really just move very strategically and not emotionally. And it's not about my opinion or what I think should be done. It really is the administration. I'm carrying out what the principals, principals want to have happen, and they've met and they've met and they've met, and they know all of the things behind the scenes that are going on in a person's life. So I think we have to really respect the government to make the best decision. We didn't know about Osama bin Laden until after it happened. If everybody knew, the situation would have never happened. So they have to move in secret and in confidentiality, and a lot of the information is classified even to those of us who are at senior level. So, you make the best decisions available to you at that time. And one of the big issues for me, I was sharing at dinner tonight, when you go in and you've been a principal of an organization as a pastor or whatever, a senior pastor, you go into an administration that's a bureaucracy, you're not the principal any longer. And so you have to understand, you don't move at your whim. So for a speech to be given, had tonight's speech been given, it would have had to be cleared by 37 people. And so by the time it got back to me, it was, it would be the administration's communication or message that they want. And you have to respect that. So you sign up for that with the job. And when you don't want to do that any longer, then you move forward and you move out of the administration. But you have to move carefully and strategically.
Thank you so much.
We're going to take just 4 more questions, 2 from this side and 2 from that side, so please.
Thank you, Ambassador Johnson-Cook, for coming this evening. My name is Jeannie Ree Moore, and I am a second-year Master of Divinity student at Candler School of Theology.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Congratulations.
My question for you is from a pastoral angle. I'm wondering if you can speak to how we might encourage interfaith engagement here in the United States. You mentioned that 9/11 was a real catalyst for interfaith engagement and an awareness that that engagement is not only important but authentic to who we are. So I'm wondering if you can speak to how we can encourage that today.
Yes, and I think what I lifted up was the partnership of faith model, that we really work. You had to be intentional about it. People don't just come together because we love each other. You have to really work at it, and you have to understand how to move and respect, kosher food and non-kosher food. If it's Ramadan, we don't plan, during the day a big luncheon because others are fasting. So with intentionality, it took about 7 years in the making, but you have to say, this is what we want to do. And it can start while you're in seminary, and that's the first place because you're in with a lot of different religions and people of other faiths. And so you can begin in seminary to make that one of your projects, perhaps even your thesis, in terms of how we can work together and partner together here in the U.S. But I think there are many models, not just the partnership of faith. And I think people really try to work towards that, particularly in places like New York and Washington, where, diversity is just an everyday experience now. So I think that you're asking the right questions, and you perhaps can be the catalyst for where it may not be existent. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your lecture, and it was very useful for me because I'm actually completing a book on some of the things you were discussing. So thank you very much again.
Welcome.
I wanted you to comment. We presented a collective working paper at the European Parliament last week because the European Union is starting to have an engagement on freedom of religion in foreign policy. And Marianne Glendon from the US Commission was there, and Knox Thames, Director of Policy of the Commission, was there. And I wanted you to comment on a statement by Thomas Farr, that I assume you know, from Georgetown University. Thomas Farr wrote a few months ago, notwithstanding the hard creative work of the State Department Office of International Religious Freedom, it would be difficult to name a single country in the world where over the past 15 years, where American religious freedom policy has helped to reduce religious persecution or to increase religious freedom in any substantial or sustained way. Now, we all know that Thomas Farr is a supporter of the international religious freedom policy of the US, but he's also to a certain extent a critic of what it has been done. So my question is, on one side we have Thomas Farr's position, and as we can see from this statement, is quite critical of what the US has done. And on the other side, we have almost have a kind of, I would call it a bandwagon effect in the sense that there are many countries all over the world that are trying to replicate the institutional aspect of the US policy of freedom of religion or belief abroad and in foreign policy. So do you think that FAR is just wrong, or that basically FAR may be right, but what the other countries are doing is that they are trying to improve what the US has done so far? Thank you very much.
That's a loaded question. But Tom Farr, who is at the Berkeley Center, also was the director one time of the International Religious Freedom Office at the State Department. So some of his criticism is good, and some of it is really sometimes not valid. I think that in general that there are countries who are trying to do the right thing, and there are some countries, as I left, Canada, for example, is replicating what the U.S. did. They have named an ambassador at the same title, the same structure, an ambassador at large for international religious freedom, Ambassador Bennett, who I got to work with very closely. And when I was leaving, there were a couple of other countries who've not made their announcements yet, and it's their right to make their announcement, who are also replicating that model. But there are many places where they may not have the same structure, but they are certainly assigning people. One country has a minister of faith. They're assigning people to deal with religious freedom specifically. So I think we have to give people the benefit of the doubt. I think we have to give them time. If our model is good and people want to replicate it, I think that we have to give people a chance to do that. I worked very closely with Ambassador Bennett's office on setting their office up. So America is also open to not only having you model us, but we work with you to build it and to build the capacity for it. So I think you have to give credit where credit is due. And so I think we're doing a good job in that area. Yeah.
Madam Ambassador, thank you for gracing our stage tonight.
You're welcome.
I have a little bit of a different question. I believe the President is a man of very deep faith and religious conviction. Yet here in his own country, he's been, in a sense, persecuted. He's been attacked by members of the religious right who have questioned his faith. In your travels around the globe, were you able to get your finger on the pulse of what other countries think about our president and his faith? Did you get the same feeling, or hopefully not?
I'll answer that in two ways. I will say he's a rock star around the world. When I just stand up and say, I bring you greetings, when I stood up and say, I bring you greetings from President Barack Obama, it was thunderous applause. It was, the world was waiting for a leader like him. I would say in this country, I contend that they're the new 3 R's we have to deal with. Before it was reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now I say it's race, religion, and respect for women. Those are the new 3 R's America has to deal with if we're going to graduate and be part of the global stage.
Last question.
Thank you once again, Ambassador.
Y'all writing that down. Give me credit when you use it, okay? I know, I saw all the pens come out. Give me credit. You first heard it here. 3 R's. All right, don't take my stuff without a footnote. Yes, sir.
I was hoping that you may be able to speak to kind of the continuancy after you've left your post and kind of what you left in place for your successor. And from a foreign policy perspective, how do we get how do we establish a long-term strategy beyond just the tenure of the appointee?
Okay, that's, you know, I think the strategies are really in place before we come. You know, we are a keg in the wheel, and it's been turning and will continue to turn. It is the United States government. I think that what we bring to the table are our gifts. Everyone comes to Washington from a place that they've been at the top of their game. You know, I was at the top of the religion game, the speaking game. There are other players who bring whatever. So I think the best thing we do in terms of strategies is we bring the gifts that we have. I think the most important gift that I brought was that I, number one, was a faith leader. Number two was a woman. I was African American, and I think you bring all of that to the table. But being a faith leader was an important role because they had never had that in the diplomatic equation. And so I think what the biggest gift I gave in terms of helping them with their strategies they go forward is that ambassadors now who are going to other countries, they have to deal with religion as part of their ambassadorial training school. Before it was, learn the language, learn what foods they eat, learn how they dress. Well, no, you have to understand and respect their culture of religion. And I think that that's going to be critical as we go ahead. We also sat down with people like the Army, the military chaplains, who are on the ground, not only with the troops, but they're in the midst of cultures. And they can make interpretations that, traditionally diplomats did not receive. So I think that the strategy will go forward with or without me, but I think that they will definitely include faith leaders in the discussion of that strategy. And it was evidenced by the words that I shared from President Obama at the National Prayer Service. But it also, the White House Faith-Based Initiatives Office brought in a faith person to the State Department, who's there until they name my successor. And his name's Sean Casey. And so he is building on the seeds that we planted. And those seeds will grow. And, the scriptures say one planted, one waters, and God gives the increase. So I think that I was one of the planters. And I think that's part of my pattern. I've been a trailblazer. You plant seeds where no one else has planted before. Someone else will come along and build upon that. And so if that makes a dent in the strategy and the foreign policy, then I hope so.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.